The night her billionaire husband threw her out into a freezing storm, he thought he had erased her from his world forever. He had no idea he had just handed her the weapon that would destroy everything he built. The night Clara stood in the grand foyer, soaked from the freezing rain, wasn't just the end of her marriage. It was the moment her entire identity was stripped away. For 12 years, she had built her life around Richard, not as a dependent partner but as the foundation beneath his rise. Before the tailored suits, the luxury estate, and the quiet power he carried into every room, there had been struggle, real, exhausting struggle. Clara remembered those early days vividly, not with bitterness but with a kind of haunting clarity. She had been the one working double shifts, coming home with aching feet and tired eyes, yet still finding the energy to reassure him when his deals fell through, when investors walked away, when the future seemed uncertain. She believed in him long before the world ever did. Richard back then was different, or at least he seemed different. He spoke with urgency, with hunger, with dreams that felt larger than both of them. He promised her that everything he was building for them. Every late night, every risk, every sacrifice had a shared meaning. Clara didn't just support him emotionally. She carried him through the most fragile stages of his ambition. She became the stability he needed while he chased instability. And slowly, over the years, his risks began to pay off. One deal turned into another, one project into a portfolio, and eventually, a name into a brand. Sterling Holdings wasn't born overnight. It was constructed piece by piece, with Clara standing quietly behind every step. But success has a way of rewriting narratives, and somewhere along the way, Richard began to edit Clara out of his story. It wasn't immediate. It happened in small, almost invisible ways. The late nights became business dinners she wasn't invited to. The conversations shifted from shared decisions to statements. The gratitude that once filled his words slowly faded into expectation. Clara noticed it, of course she did, but she convinced herself it was temporary. Stress, pressure, the cost of success. She justified it in 100 different ways because the alternative was too painful to accept. She had invested too much of herself into the life they built to believe it could all be slipping away. When Richard introduced the idea of restructuring their assets 3 years earlier, he did it with urgency and fear. He spoke of lawsuits, of competitors trying to tear him down, of needing protection. He didn't present it as a choice, but as a necessity. Clara didn't see manipulation in that moment. She saw vulnerability. The man she had stood beside for years, the man she had supported through uncertainty, was asking her to trust him one more time. And she did. She signed the documents without reading them, not out of carelessness but out of belief. Belief in him, belief in them, belief that whatever he was doing, it was to safeguard their future. That trust became the weapon used against her. Standing there in the foyer, staring at the legal papers scattered across the marble floor, Clara felt something far deeper than shock. It was a suffocating realization that every move had been calculated long before this moment. Richard hadn't just decided to leave her, he had engineered her exit. The postnuptial agreement wasn't a precaution. It was a trap, carefully constructed and patiently waited upon. The assets, the accounts, the house, everything had already been transferred beyond her reach. What she had thought was protection had actually been erasure. And what made it more brutal wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the cold precision with which it was executed. There was no hesitation in Richard's voice, no trace of the man she once knew. He spoke to her like a problem that had finally been solved. His words weren't emotional, they were transactional. 10 minutes. Vacate the premises. Security is waiting. It wasn't just a divorce, it was an eviction from her own life. The presence of Sylvia beside him added another layer of humiliation. It wasn't just that he had replaced Clara, it was how openly, how effortlessly he displayed it. Sylvia stood there wearing something that belonged to Clara's past, her grandmother's pendant resting against her neck like a quiet declaration of ownership. It was symbolic in the cruelest way. Clara wasn't just being removed, she was being overwritten. Her place, her memories, Even her inheritance of sentiment were being handed to someone else as if they had never truly belonged to her in the first place. In that moment, Clara understood something that shattered whatever remained of her illusions. Richard hadn't changed into someone new. He had simply revealed who he had always been beneath the surface. The ambition she once admired, the drive she once supported, had always been rooted in something colder, something far more self-serving. She had mistaken his hunger for determination, his focus for dedication, his confidence for integrity. But standing there, watching him discard her without a flicker of remorse, she saw the truth clearly for the first time. The most devastating part wasn't losing the house or the money. It was realizing that the years she believed were built on partnership had been one-sided. She had been real, fully invested, emotionally present. But for Richard, it had always been conditional. As long as she fit into his version of success, she had value. The moment she no longer aligned with that vision, she became disposable. Even the way he tossed the $100 bill at her feet carried a deeper message. It wasn't about helping her. It was about reducing her, turning her into something small, insignificant, dependent. It was his final attempt to define her worth on his terms. But Clara didn't pick it up. Not because she had something better waiting, but because in that moment, something inside her refused to accept the version of herself he was trying to impose. As she stood there, gripping the handle of her suitcase, she felt the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her. Not just the material things, but the years, the trust, the belief in a future that no longer existed. It would have been easy to break completely in that moment, to collapse under the sheer force of betrayal. And for a brief second she came close. The pain was sharp, disorienting, almost paralyzing. But beneath that pain, something else began to form, something quieter but far more enduring. It wasn't strength, not yet. It was awareness. A slow, steady recognition that everything she had given, everything she had built, had been taken from her under the illusion of partnership. And once that illusion shattered, it could never be rebuilt in the same way. The drive away from the estate felt unreal, as if Clara had stepped out of her own life and into someone else's nightmare. The rain lashed against the windshield in sharp, relentless streaks, each drop echoing the chaos in her mind. For miles, she didn't think about where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The mansion behind her, once a symbol of everything she had built and believed in, disappeared into the darkness like it had never existed. What remained was the cold, suffocating truth that she had been left with nothing, or at least that's what Richard believed. The only asset still in her name felt almost like an insult, the remote Snoqualmie property her grandfather had left her. Even Richard had dismissed it without hesitation, calling it worthless, barely worth the paperwork it took to transfer it. And for years, Clara had quietly agreed with that assessment. She had visited it only a handful of times, each visit brief and uncomfortable. The cabin was old, isolated, and decaying, tucked deep within a forest that felt more forgotten than peaceful. It had never fit into the life she built with Richard, never matched the polished, curated world of luxury and influence. Compared to everything else they owned, it seemed insignificant. But as the miles passed and the city lights faded behind her, that insignificant place became her only destination. Not because she believed it held value, but because it was the last piece of ground in the world that still belonged to her. It wasn't taken, it wasn't signed away, and it wasn't controlled by anyone else. In a strange, quiet way, it was the only thing Richard couldn't touch. The road grew rougher the further she drove, the smooth asphalt giving way to uneven gravel and eventually to a narrow, muddy path barely wide enough for her aging car. The deeper she went into the forest, the more disconnected everything felt. The towering trees swallowed the headlights, the darkness pressing in from all sides. There were no streetlights, no signs of life. No indication that the outside world still existed. It was isolation in its purest form. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked even worse than she remembered. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its wooden exterior warped and weathered by years of neglect. The windows were cracked or boarded up, the roof sagging under the weight of time and decay. It didn't look like a place meant for living. It looked like something abandoned long ago, left to slowly collapse into the earth. Standing there in the cold, Clara felt the weight of her reality settle in. This was it. This was all she had left. Inside, the air was damp and stale, thick with the scent of rot and dust. Every step she took caused the floorboards to creak in protest, as if the cabin itself resisted her presence. There was no electricity, no warmth, no comfort, only silence and decay. It was the complete opposite of the life she had just been forced out of. No marble floors, no golden light, no sense of security, just emptiness. For a moment, the contrast was too much to bear. The emotional whiplash of going from luxury to ruin in a single night hit her with full force. She sat down, her body heavy, her mind overwhelmed. The betrayal, the loss, the sudden collapse of everything she knew, it all came rushing back. The cabin didn't just represent what she had left, it reflected how far she had fallen. But as the silence stretched on, something shifted. It wasn't immediate or dramatic. It started as a small, almost insignificant thought, one that didn't quite fit with the despair surrounding her. This place, as broken as it looked, was untouched by Richard's influence. He had never cared about it, never invested in it, never tried to control it. In his eyes, it had no value, and that was precisely why it had survived. Clara began to look around differently, not with disappointment but with curiosity. The cabin was old, yes, and clearly neglected, but it had been built by her grandfather, a man she knew was meticulous, brilliant, and deeply intentional in everything he created. Arthur Pendleton wasn't the kind of person who did anything without purpose. Even in his later years, his mind had remained sharp, constantly working, constantly building. That realization lingered in the back of her mind as she moved through the space. The imperfections of the cabin started to feel less like decay and more like something unresolved, something unfinished. The uneven floorboards, the strange layout, the way certain parts of the structure didn't quite align, it all began to stand out in a different way. Not as flaws, but as inconsistencies. Clara knelt down near the center of the room, running her hand across the worn wooden surface. There was something off about it. Not broken, not damaged, just wrong. The pattern didn't match the rest of the floor. It wasn't random, and it wasn't the result of wear and tear. It looked deliberate, as if it had been placed that way on purpose. Her grandfather's voice echoed faintly in her memory, words she had never fully understood until now. He had always spoken in layered meanings, in quiet hints rather than direct explanations. At the time, she had dismissed it as eccentricity. Now, it felt like something else entirely. The more she focused on it, the clearer it became. This place wasn't just a forgotten cabin. It was something hidden in plain sight. The very thing that made it seem worthless to everyone else was what protected its true nature. It had been overlooked, ignored, dismissed, just like she had been. Clara's breathing slowed as a new awareness settled in. What if this place wasn't the end of her story? What if it was the beginning of something she had never seen before? The thought was almost unsettling in its intensity. For hours, she had believed she had lost everything. But standing there, surrounded by decay and silence, she began to question that belief. The idea that something valuable could exist beneath something broken felt strangely personal. Her entire life had just been reduced to nothing in the eyes of the man who once valued her most. And yet, here she was, still standing, still breathing, still capable of thinking, observing, questioning. Maybe value wasn't defined by appearance or status. Maybe it was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. The cabin, in all its ruin, started to feel different. Not comforting, not safe, but meaningful. It held a presence, a quiet tension, as if it was waiting to be understood. Every creak, every shadow, every uneven detail seemed to carry intention. It wasn't just a place, it was a puzzle. And for the first time since she was thrown out into the storm, Clara felt something other than loss. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something more grounded, more tangible. A sense that the story wasn't over, that what she had been left with wasn't meaningless after all. When the steel plate finally slid open, and the warm air rose from below, Clara didn't just discover a hidden space. She stepped into a truth that had been waiting for her long before the night she lost everything. The descent down the spiral staircase felt unreal, each step pulling her further away from the version of herself that had been standing in the freezing rain just hours earlier. Above her was decay, abandonment, and the illusion of worthlessness. Below her was precision, intention, and something far more powerful than she could have imagined. At the bottom, the contrast was overwhelming. The bunker wasn't improvised or temporary. It was engineered with purpose and foresight. Every surface, every system, every detail spoke of control and preparation. The lighting adjusted seamlessly as she moved. The air was clean and regulated, and the quiet hum of machinery carried a sense of life that the cabin above completely lacked. This wasn't a place built out of fear. It was built out of understanding. Arthur Pendleton hadn't hidden himself from the world. He had prepared for it. Clara stood still for a moment, letting the reality settle in. Her grandfather hadn't just left her a refuge. He had left her something far more complex, a controlled environment designed to outlast chaos, to operate independently, to function without reliance on anything outside its walls. It wasn't survival in the traditional sense. It was strategy embedded into architecture. As she moved deeper into the space, the purpose of it began to reveal itself layer by layer. The server racks lining the walls weren't random storage units. They were organized, categorized, and active. The blinking lights weren't just indicators of power. They represented ongoing processes, preserved data, and a network that had been running long before she arrived. This wasn't dormant. It had been waiting. The living area, fully stocked and meticulously arranged, showed another side of Arthur's thinking. He hadn't expected her to simply pass through. He had anticipated that she might need time to think, to process, to act. The supplies weren't excessive, but they were sufficient. Everything was calculated, measured, intentional. It was as if he had designed the space not just for survival, but for transformation. When Clara reached the desk at the center of the room, her attention fixed on the items placed there with deliberate care. The computer terminal, the briefcase, and the envelope weren't scattered. They were positioned. The layout itself felt like instruction, like a silent guide directing her to where she needed to begin. Her grandfather hadn't left chaos behind. He had left order. Opening the envelope shifted everything. Until that moment, the bunker had been a mystery. The letter turned it into a message. Arthur's words weren't emotional or nostalgic. They were direct, precise, and grounded in reality. He didn't speak in abstractions. He spoke in facts, in conclusions he had already reached. And the most important of those conclusions was about Richard. Clara had spent years trying to understand the man she married, filling in gaps with trust and assumption. Arthur had never done that. He had observed, analyzed, and reached a judgment long before Clara was ready to see it. In his eyes, Richard wasn't misunderstood or complex. He was predictable, ambitious, opportunistic, and willing to cross lines others wouldn't even approach. What Clara experienced as betrayal, Arthur had seen as inevitability. The realization that her grandfather had been watching, quietly gathering information, shifted her perspective completely. This wasn't a last-minute preparation. This was a decade-long operation. Every piece of data stored in the servers, every system running in the bunker, every safeguard in place, it all pointed to one thing. Arthur hadn't just suspected wrongdoing. He had documented it. As Clara absorbed the scale of what had been left to her, the emotional weight of her situation began to change. Hours earlier, she had been defined by loss. Now, she was standing in the middle of something that redefined her position entirely. She wasn't empty-handed. She was holding access to something far more powerful than money or property. She had information. Information in the world Richard operated in wasn't just valuable. It was dangerous. It was leverage, exposure, consequence. The very systems that had allowed him to rise were built on secrecy, on controlled narratives, on the assumption that no one could see the full picture. Arthur had dismantled that assumption piece by piece, quietly building a complete record of everything Richard thought was hidden. But what made the bunker truly powerful wasn't just the data, it was the way it had been structured for her. Arthur hadn't expected Clara to become someone else. He hadn't designed a system that required specialized knowledge she didn't have. Instead, he built something that translated complexity into clarity. The interface wasn't overwhelming. It guided her, step by step, allowing her to understand not just what existed, but how it connected. That was the real inheritance. Not just evidence, but accessibility. Not just power, but the ability to use it. Clara sat down at the terminal, her hands still carrying the faint tremor of everything she had been through. The screen came to life with a quiet efficiency, no unnecessary delays, no confusion. It responded to her presence as if it had been waiting specifically for her, and in a way, it had. For the first time since the night began, her thoughts started to organize themselves. The chaos, the emotional overload, the shock, it all began to settle into something more focused. The situation hadn't changed externally. She was still alone, still cut off from the life she knew, but internally something was shifting. She wasn't reacting anymore, she was processing. Arthur's final message echoed in her mind, not as a demand, but as a recognition. He hadn't told her what to do. He had given her the means to decide for herself. That distinction mattered more than anything. This wasn't about forcing her into a path. It was about removing the limitations that had been placed on her. For years, Clara had operated within a framework defined by trust. She believed in people, in relationships, in shared goals. That belief had been used against her, manipulated, exploited. But sitting there, surrounded by systems built on logic rather than emotion, she began to see things differently. Not colder, not detached, but clearer. The bunker didn't change who she was. It revealed what she was capable of when the illusions were stripped away. The woman who had stood in the foyer, shocked and powerless, felt distant now, not erased, but understood as a version of herself that had been operating with incomplete information. That version of Clara had trusted without question, believed without verification, supported without condition. This version was beginning to see patterns, connections, and consequences. The hidden legacy Arthur left behind wasn't just about exposing Richard. It was about restoring balance. It was about giving Clara the ability to see the full picture, to understand the forces that had shaped her life, and to respond with intention rather than reaction. Clara understood early that going after Richard directly would be a mistake. He was too insulated, too practiced in deflecting threats, too deeply embedded in systems designed to protect people like him. A frontal attack would only trigger his defenses, giving him time to bury evidence, control the narrative, and paint her as exactly what he had already reduced her to, a bitter, unstable ex-wife trying to claw back relevance. That wasn't just a risk, it was exactly what he would expect. And if there was one thing Clara had learned from both Richard and her grandfather, it was that predictability was a weakness. So she chose a different path. She didn't want to confront him. She wanted to destabilize him, not in one dramatic move, but through a series of precise disruptions that would slowly erode his control. The bunker gave her something Richard never imagined she would have: visibility. She could see the structure of his empire from the inside, not just as a collection of assets, but as a network of dependencies. Financial channels, shell companies, legal shields, internal hierarchies. It was all connected, and more importantly, it was all fragile in ways that weren't obvious from the outside. The first step wasn't exposure, it was pressure. Clara began by mapping out the flow of his hidden assets, identifying where his real vulnerabilities existed. Not the public-facing accounts or the legitimate business fronts, but the off-the-books channels that kept everything moving beneath the surface. Those were the lifelines he depended on, the ones he couldn't acknowledge publicly without exposing himself. And because they were hidden, they were also isolated. If something went wrong there, he couldn't simply call in help or escalate through official systems. He would have to handle it quietly, which meant slower reactions and fewer options. When she initiated the transfers, she didn't rush it. Every move was calculated to look deliberate, not chaotic. The funds didn't disappear into untraceable voids. They were redirected in a way that created confusion and forced interpretation. From Richard's perspective, it wouldn't look like a hack. It would look like authorization. That distinction mattered. If he believed the breach came from within his own secured systems, it would immediately shift his focus inward, turning suspicion toward his own people. That was the beginning of the psychological fracture. Clara didn't need Richard to know it was her. In fact, it was better if he didn't. Uncertainty would do more damage than clarity. The idea that someone had access to his most secure networks, someone who could move millions without triggering alarms, someone who understood his structure better than he did, it would force him into a state of constant doubt. And doubt, especially for someone used to control, spreads quickly. But financial disruption alone wasn't enough. Money could be lost and recovered. Accounts could be rebuilt. What Clara needed was narrative, something that would extend beyond numbers and into perception. That's where the journalist came in. Thomas wasn't just a random choice. He represented something specific, credibility damaged by the very system Clara was now targeting. He had already been pushed out, discredited, silenced. That history made him both cautious and motivated. More importantly, it made him believable. If he spoke again, people would pay attention, not just to what he said, but to why he was saying it now. Clara didn't overwhelm him with everything at once. She understood that trust, even in this context, had to be built. The initial contact was controlled, focused, just enough to spark interest without revealing the full scope. She gave him proof, something undeniable but incomplete, enough to make him question what he thought he knew, enough to make him respond. Once that connection was established, the dynamic shifted. Thomas wasn't just receiving information, he was participating in something larger. Clara guided the flow, releasing data in stages, allowing him to verify, cross-reference, and build his own understanding. That process mattered. If he simply repeated what she gave him, it would lack weight. But if he arrived at the conclusions himself, supported by evidence he had independently confirmed, it would carry authority. While Thomas worked on constructing the external narrative, Clara focused on internal destabilization. Richard's world wasn't just built on assets, it was held together by people. Lawyers, executives, partners, all operating under a shared assumption of loyalty and mutual protection. Breaking that assumption would do more damage than any public exposure. Gregory Pierce became the focal point of that effort. Clara knew his position well. He wasn't just Richard's lawyer, he was his shield. The one who understood the legal boundaries, the one who could anticipate threats and neutralize them before they escalated. As long as Gregory remained aligned with Richard, the system had a chance to hold. But if that alignment fractured, everything would become unstable. The approach had to be subtle. Direct accusations wouldn't work. Gregory was too experienced, too analytical to react emotionally without cause. What Clara needed was doubt, the same kind she had planted in Richard, but tailored differently. Not fear of an external threat, but fear of internal betrayal. The audio message served that purpose. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about introducing the possibility. A suggestion, carefully constructed, that Richard was willing to sacrifice him if necessary. The content itself didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be plausible enough to align with Gregory's understanding of Richard's character. Once that seed was planted, Gregory would do the rest. He would analyze, reconsider past interactions, reinterpret decisions. Every ambiguity would start to lean toward suspicion. And unlike Richard, Gregory couldn't afford uncertainty. His entire role depended on clarity and control. If he believed he was at risk, his priority would shift immediately, from protecting Richard to protecting himself. That shift was the breaking point Clara needed. With Richard questioning his systems and Gregory questioning his loyalty, the structure began to fragment from within. Communication would slow, coordination would weaken, and decisions would become reactive rather than strategic. They would stop functioning as a unified front and start operating as individuals, each trying to secure their own position. That was when Clara moved to the final phase. The release of information wasn't just timed, it was positioned. The article wasn't published quietly or through a minor outlet. It was placed where it would have immediate impact, where it would bypass the usual filters and reach a wide audience before any counteraction could be organized. The content itself was structured to be undeniable, not just allegations but documented connections, patterns that couldn't be easily dismissed. By the time Richard became fully aware of what was happening, the narrative was already out of his control. It wasn't just about what he had done. It was about how it was being perceived, how quickly it was spreading, how many people were now looking at him with a different lens. Clara didn't need to confront him. She had already reshaped the environment around him, turning his strengths into vulnerabilities, his secrecy into exposure, his alliances into fractures. Every move she made was designed to remove options, to narrow his path until there was nothing left but consequences. By the time everything began to collapse around Richard, Clara no longer felt the urgency that had once driven her. The anger, the pain, the need to prove something, all of it had gradually transformed into something quieter, something far more stable. What started as survival had turned into control, and what felt like revenge in the beginning now felt like resolution. She had spent weeks inside the bunker, surrounded by systems designed for precision, thinking in ways she never had before. The chaos that once ruled her emotions had been replaced with clarity. And in that clarity, she began to understand that the end of Richard's empire wasn't the true victory. It was simply a consequence. When the news broke, it didn't feel as dramatic as she had imagined it might. There was no surge of triumph, no overwhelming sense of satisfaction. Instead, there was a stillness, a quiet recognition that something had ended not just for Richard but for her as well. The version of her life that had been tied to him, built around him, defined by him, was gone. And unlike the night she was thrown out, this ending wasn't forced upon her. It was something she had moved toward with intention. Watching the final moments unfold through the surveillance feed, Clara didn't see the powerful man who had once controlled everything. She saw someone unraveling, stripped of the illusion he had spent years constructing. The mansion, once a symbol of control and dominance, had become a hollow shell. The same space where she had been dismissed and discarded now stood as the setting of his downfall. But even that symmetry didn't bring her satisfaction. It brought perspective. For the first time, she saw the full arc of what had happened, not just the betrayal, not just the retaliation, but the pattern beneath it. Richard had built his world on control, on manipulation, on the assumption that he could always stay one step ahead. And for a long time, that assumption worked. It gave him power, wealth, influence. But it also created a fragile structure, one that depended entirely on secrecy and imbalance. The moment that balance shifted, the entire system began to collapse. Clara realized that she could have continued. She could have pushed further, exposed more, held onto the systems her grandfather built, and used them to maintain a kind of power over everything that remained. The tools were still there. The access, the knowledge, the capability, it hadn't disappeared, but something inside her had changed. The desire to hold onto that power didn't feel right anymore, not because it wasn't useful, but because it no longer aligned with who she was becoming. The bunker had given her more than just a way to fight back. It had given her space to think, to see herself outside the roles she had been confined to for so long. For years, she had defined herself through support, through loyalty, through her ability to hold things together for someone else. Then, for a brief period, she had defined herself through resistance, through strategy, through the need to reclaim what had been taken. But now, standing at the end of that process, she felt something different, something independent of both of those identities. She wasn't just someone who had been wronged, and she wasn't just someone who had fought back. She was someone who had adapted, learned, and chosen her path with awareness. As she initiated the deletion protocol, watching the servers begin to wipe themselves clean, there was no hesitation. Every trace of her involvement, every pathway she had used, every advantage she had held, it all disappeared systematically. It wasn't an act of fear or caution. It was a decision, a conscious step away from a world built on secrecy and control. She wasn't erasing evidence to protect herself. She was closing a chapter that no longer needed to remain open. When she finally stepped out of the bunker, the air felt different. Not just physically, but in a way that was difficult to describe. For weeks, she had existed in a controlled environment, insulated from everything except her own thoughts and the system she operated. Now, standing beneath the open sky, there was a sense of space again. The forest around her was quiet, unchanged, unaware of everything that had just unfolded beneath it. And in that stillness, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: lightness. She didn't need the mansion. She didn't need the wealth that had once defined her life. She didn't even need the satisfaction of watching Richard fall. Those things belonged to a version of her that had been shaped by circumstances she no longer carried. What mattered now was something far simpler and far more valuable: freedom. Not the kind that comes from escaping something, but the kind that comes from understanding that you are no longer bound by it. Clara took a moment to reflect, not on what she had lost, but on what she had gained. Strength, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Awareness, not just of others, but of herself. And perhaps most importantly, the ability to see through illusions, the ones people create, the ones systems rely on, and the ones we sometimes hold onto because they feel safer than the truth. She knew the world she was stepping back into would be different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The way she would navigate it, the choices she would make, the boundaries she would set, none of it would resemble the life she had left behind. And that wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. As she walked away from the cabin, leaving both the decay above and the precision below behind her, there was no sense of uncertainty. She didn't have a detailed plan, a mapped-out future, or a defined destination. But she had something far more important: a clear understanding that she was capable of building something new, something that belonged entirely to her. And that was enough. The moral of her journey isn't about revenge or justice in the traditional sense. It's about awareness and self-worth. When you build your life entirely around someone else, you risk losing sight of your own foundation. Trust is powerful, but blind trust can become a vulnerability. Clara's story reminds us that strength doesn't always come from avoiding hardship. It often comes from facing it, understanding it, and refusing to let it define you. True power isn't in destroying others, but in reclaiming yourself. And sometimes, what looks like the end of everything is actually the beginning of something far more real and far more lasting. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. The narrative includes dramatized elements of crime, technology, and legal scenarios that may not reflect real-world accuracy. Viewer discretion is advised.